Welcome to In a Nutshell, the podcast dedicated to all things agricultural consulting. I'm Dylan Brush here with soil genius and ag consultant Bill Brush, and we're delighted to accompany you on this journey where we break down the different aspects of agricultural consulting. In each episode, we'll dive into the realm of agriculture through the eyes of Bill Brush, where consultants like Bill play a vital role in empowering farmers, agribusiness, and agricultural organizations. If you're passionate about agriculture, problem solving, and enjoy a little bit of detective work, this podcast is tailor-made for you.
Hi, this is Bill Brush, and welcome back to In a Nutshell. Well, today I'm working off a request that we got, and this request, because I had not really spoken about it on any of the previous podcasts, is talking about melons, growing melons, and what it takes to grow them, and what we're really looking at in terms of the type of melon you want to grow. Size, is it seedless, is it seeded? Many things come into your considerations. And this is going to transfer over to a lot of other crops where you say, what are you actually trying to fertilize for? What are you trying to get, and what stage of growth is this? So we're going to take you through melons, and I'm going to just use it as a general topic of melons. Obviously, there's watermelons, there's cantaloupes, there's cranshaws, many different types of melons. But we're going to just focus on the general category and get you started down that road. And this is really good for a commercial grower that's growing melons in a large scale, or it's just as fine for a gardener who has off to the corner of his garden some hills that he's planted some melon seeds in, or he has in the past, and it's not getting the results that he wants. So first we're going to start with melons in general and say, of course, it all starts with planting. And most times, although there are some variations to this, there are some actual plants that people will transplant, but most of the time we're looking at planting seeds to make that watermelon grow. You know, that's where it's going to create from the seed that someone has commercially manufactured and got it ready for your use in your own garden or in your own field. So in your garden, you tend to plant them up on a hill. You know, you make a round circle so that the water will around that circle in kind of a moat type fashion and be able to incorporate, have your water sub clear to the center. And it's important that when you start early that you get water, but not too much water on that seed so that it can germinate and start to go down into that hill and then spread its roots out to basically to be able to get in all of that area you put around the hill. So you're going to ask a question of yourself, well, how big a hill should I make this? And I'm going to say for a good sized melon, like a watermelon, something that can be very large, you need to have somewhere in the neighborhood of about a 2 foot round, or if you want to look at it, 1 foot diameter hill that you put together. That's the minimum. Of course, a watermelon or most all vine seeds like this grow to be quite large in terms of their footprint of what they put of foliage over top of the ground. So what we want to do is not put too much but we're going to have that moat, and we're going to want to keep our melons out of the moat because that water will make them decay before they're ripe. So we want to get them in there. So over a period of time, we want to lift those up, but they'll get beyond that. So when you're setting that garden up, you're going to have a 2 foot wide by 2 foot wide circle that you're going to plant those seeds right in the middle and grow it up from there. But give yourself plenty of room around that, as these vines will go out in a lot of directions and they'll be encompassing other things you got growing in your garden. So this is a good kind of a place to start. If you're in a field situation, you're actually planting them as a commercial crop, you're going to plant them down rows. Now, you're going to want them in a fairly wide rows, probably 60 inches, which is about 30 inches, which is a larger area, but you're putting your seeds and your plants closer together. So you're going to have a more, you're going to grow out and not so much around. So you're going to have a place for those melons to be grown on top of that. And then you'll also do some things like you'll move those vines and you'll actually incorporate it and move them up all onto the bed. So there's a lot of different things there. Out at home where you're looking at just one hill, maybe 2 or 3 plants, or 2 or 3 hills, or a hill of watermelons and a hill of cantaloupes, whatever it is, you can have that in your backyard garden. If you transplant, which is not nearly as routine as it is in a lot of other vegetable crops, but melons take a long time, so people have the idea of planting them early, having plenty of time to grow them up, and you'll have multiple cropping sessions where a lot of things, just take lettuce for example. You may only have 60, 75 days of growing, and when you cut it, you cut the entire plant, and then you rework the ground and plant another set of vegetables in there. This is something you'll grow out over a period of time, and then you're going to go and you're going to pick those as they ripen, and you'll wait, and pretty soon some more will ripen. And as long as you keep fertilizing, and we'll talk about how to continue to make them reproductive, as long as you keep doing that, you can harvest melons multiple times. And we see that in commercial too. We get at least 2 or 3 good solid picks, and it's expensive to run the labor through there, so we try to reside and sync them so that they are about 3 really good harvests. Some cases there'll be more, but most of the time that's a good average number, a number of times you'll go through the field to harvest those. If you transplant though, make sure that you get some initial fertilizer, a nice blend. You can scatter a little few prills on top, but you want something more complete, like a triple 15, a triple 12. Making sure you don't have any chloride, so they're not using muriate of potash or KCl to put in there, because we don't need those at all around some tender young leaves. And you can put it on top of the surface and then water it in, and that'll be something, because one of the things you want that transplant to do is get into some good phosphate fertilizer to stimulate root growth. The sooner we can stimulate root growth, the sooner we're going to get into the next phase of growth, which is vegetative. We need to grow vines out. You know, you're not going to get very successful if you have a very, very small vine that doesn't even extend out past the 2 feet of your hill or past your 60-inch beds that you plant them on. You're just not got enough vigor into them. And so when we want to go with our vegetative growth, we're going to plant most of the time a small amount, and it can come in a lot of forms, a nitrate nitrogen, which is that form that plants want for their vegetative stage. With that, and I always like to use this, it's a great product, it's calcium nitrate. And it's real hard to handle in a dry form, but if you've got a garden situation, you can put it out a little bit at a time and keep that away from water or away from moisture. And what I mean by that is even the ambient air has got moisture in it, and it'll start to go towards that calcium nitrate and make it a hard brick, because what it's doing is it's very hygroscopic, which means it's seeking water. So if you do get dry calcium nitrate, you need to keep it wrapped up really tight, open it to get what you need, and wrap it tight again so that air and that ambient moisture that's in that air get into it. High humid conditions, this humidity will really wreak havoc with it. And then it becomes really difficult to distribute because it's very, very sticky, gummy. It's just kind of, what's a good way to look at it? It's just like trying to put ice cream out in a pelletized form, but it's all in a kind of a ball or a solution, and it's gummy and wants to stick together. So what we want to do instead, a lot of times, because that, you can use a liquid calcium nitrate, and there's a couple different ones on the market. Difficult maybe to find one, but very easy to find another one, which is calcium ammonium nitrate, 17%. And it's a great product because it also has ammonic nitrogen to go with that nitrate nitrogen. And the calcium allows both of those nitrogens to be more taken up more easily. And you can get a real good jump, and it pushes both sides of the nitrogen spectrum, from the ammonic, which is the reproductive type, to the nitrate, which is the vegetative type. And you can kind of get going and get that plant really cooking and growing out. That, with a little bit of phosphate and potassium you're putting out, also will get you off to a really good start. So now our vine is out and growing. So what are we looking for next? After it's out, well, the next thing you'll notice is it'll start to put up flowering sites, bloom sites. So that's where we're going to put out flowers, and that's what's going to get pollinated to produce your melons. Well, in a commercial situation, normally we have honeybees out there that can transfer pollen and actually get things pollinated a lot easier. Most of the time you don't have what we call cross-pollination varieties where you need to get pollen from one melon to the other. These are all self-fertile, which means they will basically pollinate themselves, but that pollen still needs to go from the anther to the stamen, or from the male part to the female part of the flower. And if that being the case, then bees will be a big addition. In a commercial situation, we see it happen, essentially every melon crop's going to put those out. As opposed to in your backyard, there's a lot of inherent honeybees, even in urban situations in town. There still are these honeybees that are running around looking for something to feed. And flowers are what they go after because they're looking for not only nectar, but they're also looking for pollen. And so they're going to, and in their attempt to harvest those, they're going to pollinate that flower and move that pollen from the male part to the female part, or the anther to the stamen. And at that point, now you're going to start to develop a melon. So once we're doing that, what is the thing? And this is one of the reasons that we like to put a little bit of ammonic. There usually is some ammonic nitrogen in that triple 15 or triple 12. We definitely have it in your calcium nitrate, your liquid form. There's another product we call it CN9, or calcium nitrate. It's got almost 100% nitrate, so that's the vegetative growth. You might well use it early and then come back with a calcium ammonium nitrate later to keep it reproductive. But they're all good products. Just remember what you're trying to do when you fertilize, and I'll get to that to make sure you remember these different aspects. Well, now we have one that's pollinated. Now what's the next most important thing? We want to make sure that melon sets a viable melon, and it just doesn't create a flower that gets pollinated and then shrivels up and falls off. Not many melons are made that way, so we have to get it so that it sets. And that has a lot to do with a few of the micronutrients, boron being one, and be careful because a little's good and a lot's very, very damaging. So again, you go back to what I like to always say. If you have any idea where the soil is in terms of a soil sample, if you've got at least 1% or 1 part per million, or 1.5 parts per million of boron per acre, you have enough. And so with that in mind, you then don't need to worry about boron. But if you're less than that, you need to get some type of a granular boron. And it just takes a few little flecks around the top of your hill or a little bit down the row with some kind of something when you're cultivating, or something that maybe puts it on the top, and then you water it in with sprinklers, or your drip is there and it comes up and gets it incorporated. The other thing that a lot of people don't look at much, and it's manganese, and that's not magnesium, but manganese, M-A-N-G, manganese. And what's important about that is use a good quality manganese sulfate, because that's the plant available type. Again, you don't need very much. And this is a case where if you don't need very much, like this manganese, you can use a foliar and put it over your foliage. Again, be careful that you don't put too much, because you're putting a lot of positive energy or positive ion on with manganese, so you can do some foliage burning. So a lot of times you can be much more careful with your application if you're using a chelated manganese that you put on the ground around it, much more accepting by roots, and then gets it into the plant. That manganese is very helpful for set. We see it all the time in really anything that sets a crop, but it could be for nut crops, almonds and walnuts, pistachios, anything that is a nut crop, permanent crop. It is very important for your stone fruits, your pome fruits, your corn crops. Anything that's putting a seed on is very important to have manganese on there for set. Okay, so you say, well, if I got seedless watermelons, why would I need anything to seed? Well, first you have to make sure that the melon you're talking about gets seeded in. And if it gets set on a plant now we're going to grow the melon, which will be the next phase. But you have to get it to stay to ever get anything or realize a melon off of that. So manganese, boron. The other micronutrients are also helpful. Zinc will give you better distribution of nutrients. Copper will give that more resilience. So if you really want to look at it, a good way to look at micronutrients is just put a balanced blend of iron, manganese, copper, and zinc. And there's a lot of them out there that you can use to fulfill all those micronutrients if you don't have a soil sample. Well, after we set a melon, what's the next thing that happens? Melons start to grow and they can get big. And they can actually look like they're growing every day. You can see how fast they're growing. So you look at them one day and they don't look very big, and then they're twice that big, and they just keep expanding. So when we look at them, we always want to say, what do we need to make them expand? And it's really simple. If you're going to expand any tissue, you need to have cell division. And that's a function of nitrogen, particularly nitrate nitrogen, because it's easily accepted by the plant. We've already reproduced because we have a melon, so nitrate becomes the kind of the key. If you're putting a mixed nitrogen like a UN32 or a calcium nitrate that's 17%, it's actually got ammonium and nitrogen in it. If you're putting CN9, you're all nitrogen. So, and I'll explain why the calcium becomes probably your preference as you go forward. Because after you get your nitrogen, you get cell division, you need calcium, not only to fill that vacuole, the inside of that cell, you also need it to glue cells together. They just don't create cells that are loose and fly away. They have to literally stick together. And that's a function of the substance between cells, which is calcium pectate. It gives that ability to hold those together. And then once you're beginning cell division, you need to follow that up and give that cell structure, which is a function of getting good, strong cells, and that takes potassium. So when you get through this phase and you're starting to expand the melon, the next thing is you're going to worry about ripening. And what do I mean by ripening? This melon's as big as I want, and it's kind of stopped growing. What do I really want when I open it? If it's a watermelon, I want that deep red color, and I want it brimming with water, but also brimming with sugar. That sweetness that you get from a really good watermelon. Or the same could be said of a cantaloupe, a cranshaw, any melon. Nobody really likes them not sweet, so that's what you're looking for. So one strategy to use is during that expansion phase, you need the potassium. Why not use potassium sulfate? It's also known as SOP in the trade, but potassium sulfate. And the reason I say potassium sulfate is it's readily found in most places. Stay away from potassium chloride. Potassium chloride will give your melons a more salty, more bitter taste. Not something anybody's going to be really happy with. But sulfur, because of what it does internally inside the plant metabolism, leads to not necessarily the production of more sugar, but taking and stabilizing that sugar and turning into what I call complex carbohydrates. Carbohydrates that don't break down quickly. If your photosynthesis, the function of that is to make glucose. And that glucose goes down and gets put down into the roots for feed and then sent back up to the rest of the plant. Well, if it doesn't have enough sulfur, it can't make these complex carbohydrates. So you put basic glucose back into that stream and you will get a melon or fruit or whatever you're growing, not a long shelf life. We'd like to be able to pick that melon, be able to put it in the refrigerator and keep it for several days, or set it on the counter in your kitchen and let it sit several days. If it's made with simple sugars, it basically will ferment quickly, and when it does, you will get the classic, one side of it where it's usually when it's sitting down on will begin to decay, deteriorate, and a lot of your melon, if not all of it, are gone. So think about potassium sulfate. The sulfur will give you that. And so you're actually putting two products on at one. Yeah, we need the potassium, but for the type of crop we're growing, it is that sulfur becomes very important if you're seeking something for shelf life and sweetness. We've got everything into our melon, and now it's got to the level and it's maturing. Next comes to harvest. I'd like to tell you I know exactly when to harvest a melon, but I don't. I've seen guys out there that do this all the time. They thump it with their finger. If it feels a certain way, they harvest it. If it doesn't have the right turgor on the outside of that melon, they just walk by them and they go to the next one. These guys are just, if you did thousands of melons per day, you would get good at this, and they do. The ones they leave behind, if you follow back and say, I wonder, and you cut it, no, they're not quite ripe. Or they look almost ripe, but they're a little pale, and they don't have the sweetness. So they're leaving them for the next pick or the next pick beyond that. The problem you have in a home situation, in a garden, is you try one, and it doesn't have to do with size, and it doesn't have to do with shape. The only thing you've got is taste. And sometimes you have to sacrifice one and says, no, I'm going to tap this one. How's that feel? Open it. No, it's not ripe yet. So I'm going to sacrifice one to get more education. So the next time I know when it feels that certain way, and you'll feel that you'll get good at it after a while when you thump it or whatever. I see a lot of people in the grocery store doing that all the time, even though those have been pretty well done in the field, the ripening, and so they're pretty good at that. So now you've taken it all the way through that harvest. Now your next step is what? Grow the next set. Some will be half formed. So the next part is you started from ground zero with nothing ripe. Now you're going to have things in between ripeness. And in a garden situation, it makes perfect sense that we're going to harvest 2 or 3 melons this week, and we'll have some maybe to give to our neighbors, or we will then see these other ones coming on, and we're going to have melons for several months, as long as we continue to grow them the same way you grew the beginning ones. And you go back to, where are we? We're past bloom, or we got some bloom, and we want to make sure they set. We want to make sure we're always in expansion mode. We're always in ripening mode. And so you begin to have carryover from those previous fertility things, but you just keep adding a little back in as you go through. Eventually, this vine will say, that's enough, and it'll quit on you, and you'll have less and less till you finally say, we're going to now remove it and start on to the next crop. In a field situation, now it's economics. Do I have enough good ones? I'm going to let some that get overripe that I can't use, and I'll still have some that are underripe, but I'll have enough of the ripe ones to come in there and harvest them and get another viable pick. And I said, they'll usually come back a third and sometimes a fourth time through that same field, and they'll always doing an economic evaluation. Can I send a crew through and harvest enough melons to make it worth my while? So it's always an economic decision. So remember, if nothing else, always remember, whether it's watermelons or fruit or whatever crop you grow, you ask yourself some very simple questions. The first one being, what do I want from this planting? Do I want nice, sweet greens, lettuces that are really good? Sometimes we see a lot of lettuce I don't think that's grown very well. It's got a little taste, could be a little old, could be a lot of things that it's changing from vegetative to reproductive, and it doesn't have that. You have control of that. Same thing is that people in commercial will do what we say walk by. Those are either too old or they're not mature enough, and they walk by those and they only cut the ones that are of good value. So what do I want? Okay, if I want to harvest the reproductive portion, that's a whole different ball game. Now, then I go for what part of the plant do I want, and what's it take to stimulate that? We talked about melons, and so I'll try to stay that way. How big do I want them to grow? Okay, what shape do I want them to be? I can lengthen them out and make them long and lean, or I can bunch them up and have a shorter, more dense watermelon. I know one of my experiences in growing watermelons one time was I grew a bunch and the weather was cool. It was difficult to get these melons really to size up the way we wanted to. I know we commercially harvest them. We went in and took them into the shed. They look through them and they go, how come we got so many small ones? We need big ones. We need them larger, etc. So I went back into the field. The weather got nicer. We pushed them hard to get them bigger. But what the packing shed found was they took those smaller ones to market. They were sweeter, better tasting, and they did something that none of us thought about doing. They were perfect size to put into your refrigerator. They weren't a big long melon that took up half the bottom of one shelf or all of a shelf with that big one. But they fit perfectly for a small household with maybe only 2 people in it, or maybe somebody that's single. They love these, what I call personal size watermelons. So when the next bunch came in, they said, where are the small ones? We can't keep them on the shelf. We're selling every one of them. Well, again, you got to know what you want, because you can't change it once you've activated this melon to do the things that you can change. And also, in terms of that size and shape, the flavors that we can adjust. I think every time you're always going for that same dense, sweet flavor that the juice just sticks to your hands because it's got so much sugar in it. And then finally, the durability, which I told you, is using the proper amounts of sulfur and potassium and the rest of the major nutrients, the NPK, calcium and magnesium, along with sulfur, that give you those complex carbohydrates. And hopefully you're successful doing it. I found that melons is a kind of a learning crop. In a commercial situation, you kind of have to know what you want to do initially and are able to go do it. As opposed in your backyard, it's a learning crop to understand when's a good time to harvest. What do I need to do to turn it on to get bigger? What I need to do to turn down to make them smaller, depending if you want size. And then durability is strictly getting the proper nutrients in that so that it can make those sugars that are long lasting. So hopefully on melons, that was helpful today. And keep questions coming in. If there's a crop I haven't covered, or a series of crops that are similar that I haven't covered, please ask on our question area of our podcast. And I'll sign off for today. So until next time, stay curious.
Thanks for another absolutely fantastic episode of Agriculture in a Nutshell, Bill. I'm sure that everyone listening surely loved everything you had to say and explain about melons. For all of you listening, please make sure to leave a like, comment, and subscribe, and always stay curious.